Hey everyone, Ben from JangaFX here. Today we're going to make a twister. We're going to be using an awful lot of particles in this tutorial, and these particles are all going to be driven by forces. This one is all about balance. There are several forces working in concert here, so as we add things into the simulation, we're likely going to have to go back and adjust properties here and there. First things first, let's prepare our default scene for what we're going to make. I'm going to set up our domain to 256, 256 and 256. I'm also going to remove the skybox and the ground just for now. So in our particle emitter, we're going to want to drop out any instance of fire or temperature. I'm also going to take out velocity totally just for now. I'm also going to head over to the simulation tab, force, and then I'm going to drop our buoyancy down to about 10%. And I'm going to make sure that solid ground is enabled here. Now you might think that making a twister, our particle emitter is going to take the shape of some kind of column in the air, but it's actually not. We're going to turn this into the ground. So for our primitive, we're going to choose a box. We're going to make sure that it is wide enough. Let's say 35 by 35 by 1. Okay, we're just going to make a slab of geometry, and we're going to bring it down to 0 here. And then this is all going to change quite a bit. Just to help us visualize this, let's turn off the noise and let's bring in a line force. It's already set up in a vertical arrangement, but it's pushing. So let's turn that down and bring in twist. Let's say 2 just for now. Now the problem here is it's going to be twisting absolutely everything in the scene, so we're going to want some fall off. So I'm going to enable, let's go quadratic, and you can see that we've got the shape of our line force here. I'm going to bring our fall off radius down to 3, just so it fits neatly in the scene. But we're going to change how our particle emitter on the ground acts. I'm going to bring smoke all the way up, but we're going to freeze the particles. We're going to emit frozen particles. We're going to make sure that these particles don't start their life cycle until they are unfrozen. So we're going to pause until unfreeze. Our lifetime limits, I think I'm going to set around 4 maximum. So yeah, nothing happens because the particles that are being born inside of this volume here are frozen. They're not active yet, not until a force gets introduced. A force that's strong enough to wake them up. Currently, our line force isn't strong enough. So if we reset and play, if we bring our twist strength up to say 10, it will start to wake those particles up and they'll start to emit smoke. It's a good start. But I don't want it to be 10, I want this to be 3. And I want to play with the value at which these particles will start to become active. Okay, so just as a starting point, I've got my line. It's pushing upwards at 1, it's twisting at 3. I've added in a repel strength here of -5. What that does is, as it spins, it tends to fly outwards. This repel force is going to bring it back into that central core of the line force. I've also added some internal fall off, so like an inner bound of 3 meters. So inside this highlighted part of the line force, not much is happening. This stuff is being spun around by what's happening inside this outer part. You might find sometimes that when you're trying to get these things to take shape, they can become a little bit unruly and kind of misbehave and not do what you want them to do. So I've added in a velocity dissipation to the simulation node of 80%. If we were to crank this all the way down, it wasn't there originally, so at 0%, this thing is likely to sort of spin out of control. And what I do with this velocity dissipation is I add it in quite high and then dial it down. So let's say 80, reset. All it means is that any smoke that isn't directly being manipulated by a force slows down. And it gives it a chance for the forces to catch that smoke and move it in the way that you want it to be moved. And also, when you dissipate the velocity, you tend to slow smoke movements down, and it can increase the perceived scale of these things as well. So you can make something look a lot larger if you sort of sap the velocity out of it over time. And that's what this slide is really useful for. Okay, so we got a good starting point. There's a few more things that I want to do to this though. We're going to make 2 more emitters. So I'm going to Control C and Control V this one. And we're going to name these. We're going to call this one smoke funnel or something like that. This one we're going to call debris. And they're going to kind of work in the same way, but they're going to give us different things. I'm going to put the same primitive shape into this one. So this flat plane here is going to feed this particle emitter, but it's going to give us particles that we're doing something else with. So for this debris one, I'm going to plug it in over here. In fact, let's take the first one off just for now. And currently, it's got the exact same setup as the first one, so we're going to change this. Our injection, we are going to remove smoke, so it doesn't bring any smoke into the simulation. And rendering, I want to be able to see these particles, so we can see what's actually happening on the ground now. If we bring our original particle emitter back in, we can see that our visible particles are getting mixed in with this smoke. So I would use this to give the perception that there's some bits of debris on the ground that are getting picked up and swirled around. So you can just make out that there's small things flying around in there and that it's not just smoke. But the problem is you end up with this ground plane that's full of stuff, and you don't want that to always be visible. So I use a trick to make it so that you can only see it once it starts to move. And what we're going to use for that are the modulation settings over here in rendering for our debris particle emitter. So let's set the initial color at white. That's cool. Our modulation type, I want to modulate over speed, because the ones that are just sat on the ground have 0 speed. I want to tie that to a value that says don't be visible. And we do this by exposing the modulation color. There we go, we've got a pin out here. So if we pull this out and select a gradient, we can see that currently all of the non-moving particles are set to white, all the way over here. So let's swap these guys over. Let's bring white to the left, black to the right. And as we bring this white one further to the right, more and more moving particles should become visible. Yeah, looks about right. Now, those particles that are still on the ground are not actually invisible. It's just because we've got a black background. So if we turn on Skybox, yeah, they're totally still there. But we also have control over the alpha of these colors. So let's bring that all the way down. They are now invisible. Okay, so it could use a little bit of tinkering around, but in essence, what happens here is all these particles that are on the ground are invisible until they start to move, and then they become the color that we want. Okay, I've got those debris particles working roughly how I want them to work. I'll revisit them later and make them look a bit better. For now, I want to add a couple more things in. So I actually want a second line force. So let's just pause for a sec, and we'll talk about why we're doing this. I'm going to Control-C, Control-V this. I'm going to plug them in just down here. But I'm going to change the shape of it. I want it to be shorter. I want this to represent where our twister meets the ground. So we're going to use a line segment here. That's going to turn it into a much shorter piece, and we can dictate sort of how long this is. Let's say 3, something like that. Let's just check that it's kind of meeting the ground. Yeah, this is about right. I'm going to give it a bit more fall off. So our radius is there. So let's bring this out. Maybe this down. And this one up to 5. And I'm going to give it a bit of extra twist. So let's say 5 on this one. Let's just see how that looks. Okay, so what that's done for us is it's given us a bit more violence down the bottom here, but it is throwing things around up here a little bit too much. So this is where that balancing act comes in. I'm going to play around with the negative repel for both of these forces. I'm going to try and rein it in just a little bit. All right, so with the help of a noise node feeding into the simulation node, which has got a bias of 5 in the Z direction there, that's pushing everything up. That's helping us to build the kind of shape that I'm after here. I've just turned off the debris node just because I haven't shaded that yet. So let's go back into there. Let's turn it on, and we'll see all the particles that show up are just too brightly lit. So we need to change this. We're going to go over into rendering. They're lit. That's good. The initial color, we need to change this. We don't want it to be bright white. I'm just going to go with like a neutral gray. Hit refresh, and they're still too bright. So let's find out what's going on here. There we go. It was our modulation color. So yeah, the floating debris is a much better color to my eyes now, but it's still moving too uniformly. So let's play with that a little. Maybe we can tell those particles to use, where are we, active forces. This is where they're riding the volume there. They are adhering to it between 55% and 75%. So let's bring this down to say 20 something. And it should mean that, you know, a certain portion of those particles will kind of not listen to the volume quite as much as the others. So we should get a slightly less even look. Okay, it's maybe too far, but it's along the right line. So let's go back. Let's punch in, say, 40, hit reset. That's a bit more like it. Now, as for the look of the particles, let's go back in here. Let's go shape. Right now, they're just dots. I quite like to use our particle render type to be a velocity aligned. And I tend to go for asymmetric. And that's just it's going to stretch them in the direction that they are traveling. It's going to sort of give them a kind of fake motion blur. Another thing I like to do is, because these particles aren't bringing anything into the simulation, they are there just for show, I'm going to change some of the sizes. So right now they're going to appear between this lower value and this higher value. So if we bring this higher value up, we should start to see some larger particles creep in there. Yeah, it's definitely some larger ones and some smaller ones. So yeah, I've got the basic shape that I want. It looks like it's moving about right. I would probably experiment with adding one more emitter in here in the center, and that's our old friend, the volume emitter. So let's bring these guys down. Let's just see if it works or not. If it doesn't work for us, then we'll be all right with just this, but let's try it out. So emitter volume. I'm going to bring in a shape. Right, let's pause everything for now. We're going to use a primitive, and we're going to use a cylinder. If you can't see it, go to visuals and then click on show emitter. So there's our cylinder right there. So let's change the shape up a bit. I want this guy to be fairly thin. So let's say radius of 1 and height. Doesn't really matter if it goes through the floor and through the ceiling, because we're going to make it invisible. We're just going to make it give birth to, you know, some smoke to get caught up in this swirl. So let's tell this emitter under its emission tab here to not bring any fuel, to not bring in any temperature. All we want is the smoke. Let's say 50, something like that. And just for a sec, let's turn off these guys. And yeah, so this cylinder is definitely emitting smoke, but it's sat on top of these two force lines and they're both pushing it up really, really quickly. So something we could do is under our emitter and then emission tab, we've got additional pressure. If we were to give this, say, I don't know, 25 or something, it would increase the sort of rate that it's pushing it out from the shape with. So you'll see what I mean. So it's just a bit more visible now. So let's turn these other two on, see what that's done to the overall look. Now, yeah, you could argue that it's just too much now. It's just looking too smoky, but you could maybe try and rein it in with this line force here. If we have a look at our general fall off radius, let's just try something like 5. See if that captures everything that's on the outside. And if we click off of it. Okay, yeah, that's not too bad. So we've got our debris. We've got our main smoke that's coming from particles on the ground. And we've also got this central core here, which is really there just to sort of fill in any blanks, because sometimes when you use just the smoke and the debris from the floor, you can end up with sort of empty spots, and it doesn't look very dramatic when it's not very full. Yeah, this is cool. This is not too bad. So if you've got a twister, you might want to move it. Now the problem is we've got a shape here. We've got these guys don't move, but we've got this shape. We've got these lines. They've all got to move in concert. You know, if you want to move this one thing as an entity, then you're going to have to tell all of these things to move at the same time. There's actually a neat little trick you can do. So if we pause for a sec, click on one of our forces, go to the transform tab, and then click on import control. You notice that you get a little pin out here as an input. Let's do the same for the other one. So transform, import control. I'm going to do the same for our primitives as well. Transform, import control. So thinking about it, these are the three things that really make it up, okay? Because our emitters here, the stuff that comes up from the ground is actually all around. It's not just in this spot. So these line forces and this primitive could move anywhere on this square, and it would still kind of look the same because it would just be hoovering this stuff up from the ground. So these are the three things that we need to move. We turned on import control, and you'll find that if you pull out from this pin, it gives you an import node, which is what we're going to use, but we're not going to bring in any geometry. We're just going to connect all of the import control to the transform here. All that's saying is, when I move this empty import node, it's going to move these guys, and they're all going to go to the same spot. So let's try this out. Let's keyframe something. So back to the beginning, we are going to animate the position. We're going to say, you go there on this frame, and we're going to bring you over here. So hitting R to go back, it will give us that first keyframe, and that should confirm that our animation is set. So this one import node's transform is going to drive the primitive and the two line forces. So let's try it out. We should have a traveling twister. All right, cool. So I changed something there. I actually changed the length of the animation between this corner and this corner, because it was actually moving far too quick for the simulation to really keep hold of the smoke. So in changing how long it takes to get from point A to point B, I've given those two line forces more of an opportunity to hold on to the smoke that's within their fall off ranges. And that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Where would you go from here? You'd want to color this thing a bit, all right? So let's have a look at our shading node over here. Remember, we got no flames, so we can actually just turn that off. What we're interested in here is the smoke, maybe lighting. What we're interested in here is the smoke and maybe the lighting tab as well. So you got some control over shadows in this one here. So let's find a good point in the animation. That seems pretty good. And while we're at it, I'm going to go into simulation over to Vorticity. I'm going to pump this up to say 15, maybe bring in some larger Vorticity as well. So we can bring a bit more crunchy detail into there. That's pretty good. But I want to bring some shadowing into it, because I want this thing to be quite thick with dust and debris. So on our shading node, bring up the ambient occlusion a little, maybe all the way. So you can pull around the smoke shadow density. That can make those shadowed areas darker. Something around there looks good to me. I think what I want to play with here really is the coloring. So we're on a color ramp there. I want an exposed color gradient, and that's given us a pin out here. So let's drag this out, bring in a gradient, and that's just going to give us white and black at the moment. So if we drag this around, it will start to show us the bits that it's going to color black. So let's sort out our range, and let's mess with this. Let's stick with a kind of gray but kind of brown. So let's get a kind of dark there. Bring in a bit of red. Let's put our saturation down. So yeah, that's looking pretty good to me. So where could you go with this then? So one thing that I've really enjoyed messing around with, and that is, it's just using the idea of this original particle emitter. It's the ground, right? So we've just animated some forces to pick up particles and then pull smoke out of them, or pull the particles themselves and move them around. But this doesn't have to be a flat plane. This could be a mountain, or a house or a barn or something like that. And that's what I did in an experiment just before recording this tutorial. So if I show you that real quick. All right, so I've got pretty much, it's a little more messy, but I've got my import node, and that's pushing these lines around. They're all tied to that. So if we scrub through this, we'll see that moves across. Okay, so that's all our forces, and they're going to be pulling dust and debris off of this floor, and that's our emitters over here, these guys. But what I've also got is another particle emitter here, and that's using a different import node, and that's pointing to an FBX, just something that I found on Sketchfab, I think. I'll find the owner of the file and make sure they get credit. Unfortunately, we won't be able to share that, but it's very easy to find or even build your own objects that you can scatter around on the floor, to represent a barn or a farm or whatever. And in any case, when we hit R and play, it's going to look at our FBX. I've told it to do a quick burst emission over here, look, and it's just going to fill the surface of that FBX with loads and loads and loads of particles, and they are all frozen. Okay, it takes a simulation force of 1 to detach these particles and to start throwing them around in the air. So if we go back to the beginning, let's step through. So you can see that the line force, this is the fall off radius of that line force. It just starts to pull it in. And at the same time, it's pulling smoke from this emitter, okay? And also debris from the same emitter. So we've got 2 different types of particle action going on there and another bunch of particles going on here. As we step through, you see that it's tearing chunks off this house and pulling them into the vortex. I think my favorite part is the way it sort of pulls things along the ground like this. Or what you could do if you really, really wanted to, you could have, this particle emitter could also be emanating some smoke. We'd need a tiny amount, let's say like 3, and then see what happens. So it would give the impression that there's dust being pulled off of this thing as well. In fact, that kind of glues it all together a little. I quite like that. It's pretty to look at and utterly terrifying. Okay, cool. So to recap, it's actually quite simple. Let's take it all the way back to basics. We've got 2 particle emitters. It's a box shape, okay? Just a short, like a ground plane, but it's got a little bit of thickness in it. We're plugging that into a particle emitter, and we're having it emit frozen particles. So make sure both of these are ticked. So as the particles are born, they are stopped and they are paused until they become unfrozen. That means that their life cycle, the length of time that they live, the things that they do while they're alive, none of those happen until they are unfrozen. To get anything to happen to these particles, you need to have a force that will wake them up. And the force that wakes them up is our line forces over here. I've got one main line force, which is pushing upwards, and it's also twisting round. It's also pulling in with a negative repel strength. I also added a slight amount of negative pressure just to help pull things in. And you have to make sure that you use fall off, because if you don't have fall off, then the entire scene is going to get caught in that line force. So that's our main one. We've got this one here, which is just a smaller one. It's less tall. It may be slightly wider. I tend to find that having a stronger twist strength works well because you get almost like a pinching effect down the bottom of the vortex. That's also got some negative pressure. For some reason, I've turned off the negative repel on here, but hey, it works for this simulation. Like I said, there are a bunch of moving parts and you have to sort of turn things on, turn things off, and see what works for the way you want it to look. So there's our 2 main forces. I've made a couple of these before where I've actually used a third one, a toroid, and I've put it up the top with some negative pressure so that any smoke that's hanging around at the top of the scene, it can actually get sort of sucked into this and, almost disposed of, a way to tidy up all of that loose smoke. But it wasn't really needed in this one. And then lastly, your mileage may vary, but I've added a primitive, in this case, that's combined with some noise, into a volume emitter just to add, a bit more body to the center of this twister. Although that's hard to see with all the bits of barn flying around in it. Cool. So twister, pretty easy to make, pretty easy to animate. Don't forget that you can use the import control. That's always going to be under transform, and there'll be a tick box somewhere, import control. And then you can drive it with an import node. You can animate this empty import node to move those things around that are connected to it. And that's how we've got our twister coming across this barn. Obviously, you should go and make one right away and try, destroying a couple of farms or something like that. Make sure you show us what you make, because I'm dead interested to see what people make of these twisters and what they're going to look like. And in the meantime, get in touch on Twitter, on Discord. If you've got any questions about this, just shout and we'll jump on it and we'll help you out. Check the description of this video. There'll be a couple of download links. There'll be a preset, but I don't think I'm able to share this FBX model. But you can find your own quite easily on Sketchfab, or you could even make your own and then bring it into EmberGen that way. And I believe next time we've got flamethrowers, and that's going to be with particle emitters again. So I'll see you in the next video.